And you are all set to go.
Hey, welcome everyone to the Issaquah Park Board meeting on February 28th, 2022. And I'm going to call the order to start the meeting and begin with roll call. So as I move through here, board members, please take yourself off mute if you are and acknowledge your attendance when I call your name. Danielle.
I'm here.
Marlene.
I'm here.
Zach.
Here.
Chris.
Here.
Jonathan.
Here.
Brenda.
Present.
Ruben, Linda, and Jeremy. Don't see those three. Perhaps they'll join us later, but we do have a quorum, so thank you for that. Everybody have an opportunity to review minutes from our last meeting in January. Any questions or comments or corrections? Not seeing any hands. The only correction I have is, I think I pointed this out again last time, but as much as I like the concept of Carl visiting us by spirit here, I don't think he's been in attendance. So Melissa, if you could remove Carl from an attendee from our meeting in January, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm gonna reach out to clerks too. I think it's a system issue that I don't have control of. It just keeps populating it. So I'll reach out to them to make sure that that doesn't show up again.
Okay. Didn't have anything else. Any objections to approval of minutes? Seeing no objections, minutes are hereby approved. Melissa, do we have any public comments?
I'm gonna unmute. We have Connie Marsh on the line tonight, so let me unmute her and find out if she's got some public comments for us.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Hi.
Bye. Can I video too?
Sure, we'd like to see you if you can.
Well, it's not up to me.
You do that, Melissa?
Be able to turn your video on.
She did it.
Yep.
Thank you. You are
There you
sending.
are.
There you go. See my head?
I do.
Hi, hi,
Hey.
y'all. I'm
Hi.
Connie Marsh, and I live up here on Squawk, where we have had massive water coming down one side of Squawk and not so much coming down the other side of Squawk in the rain. So that's how narrow our rain systems are. It's always interesting to watch. So I was reading Stacy Goodman's article in the newspaper about the carbon credit situation for Bergsma and whether it's true or not. It said that the money is going to go into the general fund. Now, we don't have earmarks in the general fund, so there's nothing that would say that the money would be allocated toward anything protective of Bergsma or ensuring the quality of Bergsma if the money goes into the general fund. So I don't know if the newspaper article is true, but I would request that that money go into a fund earmarked for Bergsma and its enhancement and weed removal and upkeep, because the idea is we're supposed to be keeping high quality forest in ever more excellent condition if we're going to give away carbon credit. You don't just put it in the general fund and let it be used for something like paving. Next thing is the sporting field assessment. So I sent you all an email that talked about the need to look at critical areas in our sporting fields, because as we found out from Hillside Park, when you have enough water standing in an area, it turns into they call it a wetland. And so we cannot really consider what our sporting fields are unless we have the critical area assessment of them, because we have a lot of water. sitting in, especially Tibbetts, and our varying parks, sporting fields that are on sort of perches like fill. And we also have wetland buffer that intrudes into some of those fill areas. And I think you have to plan with all the information in hand, which brings me to the next point, which is we are now looking at draft language for the new Critical Areas Code 18.8. And it has a thing called public agency exemptions, which is one of the things that interfaces with the Parks Department. And so as a steward of the land, the Parks Department language shall support the concept that the Parks Department is supposed to be protecting our natural environment. But there's a nuance in we also have a need for recreational uses. So where is that point that should be in the code to protect our lands and allow for recreational uses? What I see so far is like a blunt sledgehammer, no nuance at all, pretty well unenforceable. And so I don't think we even have had a conversation about where the Parks Department should find that sweet spot. And now is the time to have that conversation. And the more people who will give considered opinions on where that sweet spot should be, the better the likelihood that we'll actually get something to make a great Parks Department and a great environment. So if you all wouldn't mind, I don't expect you to read the draft code necessarily unless you're crazy, but at least ask for an update on what that code says and have a discussion on what you think it should say and what the implications of it all are. Please, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Connie. Always good to hear from you. Melissa, we have anybody else standing by to make a comment from the public?
Not tonight, no.
Thank you. So we're on to regular business. We have 3 items this evening to talk about. First one is the Capital Finance Task Force. We're going to talk about kind of an update on Green Issaquah. And we're going to have a presentation on the citywide athletic fields. Looks like I'm up first to give a little bit of a recap about the Capital Finance Task Force. This has been a long effort, started in September, and we're just kind of winding it up here. Our last meeting was at February 8th. Our next meeting is this Wednesday, March 2nd, which is actually also our last meeting. We're kind of on February 8th, we talked about kind of the draft of the recommendations of the task force. And our next meeting is to kind of finalize that recommendation, which will be presented to the mayor and city council next Monday on March 7th. That's a little bit of the timeline. This has been an interesting experience. We have a lot of pushing initiatives in a variety of different directions, and so it's very difficult to reach consensus. We've reached agreement on a number of things, but we also are apart on a number of key issues as well. So it'll be interesting to see how the council moves through that. And it'll probably evolve over time because this is kind of a lengthy process, in terms of to get it started. I'd have to say that there's some good news for parks and there's some bad news for parks. I've been pushing some headwind here, and unfortunately, I'm the only one from Parks that's represented on this task force, and so I'm kind of the Lone Ranger in that respect. But you know, it's a difficult situation. As I've pointed out before, we've kind of centered on three priorities, that being transportation, parks, and facilities. And essentially, you know, those are really the three huge aspects of infrastructure for the city. And, you know, a little history. Over the last 20 years, this city has actually grown substantially. And unfortunately, the city hasn't kept up with infrastructure as well as it would have liked to for a variety of reasons. You know, parks probably has kept up better than transportation and maybe facilities as well, in part because of the community support for parks, and in part because we've been successful with two bond measures in parks over the last 20 years. Our last one being 2013. And so, you know, one of the things that came out early on in this process was establishing what the community felt the priorities were with some of the big ticket items in infrastructure. And transportation really came out with the community as being a high priority and least satisfied. And so that's essentially why transportation has come to the top of the list as being the #1 priority for infrastructure improvements. Parks actually did pretty well there. I mean, in the sense that it's a priority, but the community felt that they're very satisfied with the way parks have kept up and are doing. So that's good and bad. It's good in the sense that they've kept up. It's bad in the sense that it puts parks in the tail end of the timeline of infrastructure projects. The timeline really essentially got broken out into three different categories: short, medium, and long range. Short range being 0 to 3 years, mid range being 4 to 6 years, long range being 6 to 9 years. And to some extent, it was broken out that way because you just can't tackle all of these things at once. They really do need to be spaced out because there's no way that the community could ever afford everything at one time. We did reach consensus that these next couple years is just really not right for trying to approach the community with any new funding tools. I mean, we've identified a number of funding tools to be utilized in these three priorities, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but did not feel that the next 2-3 years was appropriate. I mean, we're coming out of a pandemic, we're still in the midst of it. Inflation is really bad. Now we've got a war on the horizon. I mean, there's just a lot of social and economic issues that make it not a good time over these next couple of years to approach the community on additional funding for infrastructure. So given that as a background, the short measure is none of these priorities are going to fall within there in terms of any new additional funding tools. However, the city does actually have $9 million from the American Rescue Plan Act that needs to be spent within the next 2 years. So by 2024, actually, we need to utilize that $9 million. There's a little bit of a catch to it in the sense that as long as the project contracts are in place by 2024, you can extend that a little bit, even to 2026 in terms of when the money has to be paid out. But essentially, they want to try and accomplish that ARPA money within the next 2 years. So it's actually probably a good time for us to, have this short term be using money that the federal government is going to give the city for some infrastructure issues. We're all over the board in terms of how that money should be distributed. That that's not something we've reached consensus on. However, we do want to, we have all somewhat agreed that, transportation probably gets maybe, the bulk of it to some extent, and then facilities and parks will also get a portion of that. In some respects, I think it'll be up to the department heads of those three categories to really zero in on the CIP over the next 2 years and even maybe beyond to determine what projects are a high priority that can be accomplished in the next couple years, and make a proposal to get, a portion of that money. But it looks like, parks will at least get potentially a few $1 million out of this ARPA money over the next couple years, which should be in addition to general fund money that's already been slated for the next couple years in Park CIP. So just to give another little recap, Parks CIP has really been established over somewhat of a 20-year period as a result of the park strategic plan that we put in place a few years ago. That's essentially what's fueling the CIP. And so the 6-year CIP, there's about a little over $39 million worth of projects over the next 6 years in parks. Only about roughly $1.5 to $2 million a year of that will be allocated from the general fund. So we're missing about $4.5 million a year to be able to keep up with parks infrastructure. So that's the dilemma. After the 6-year CIP, the longer range, there's $102 million and change for projects that span, the next 14 years after the 6-year CIP. So, there's a total of $140-some million in projects that we're trying to fund, and that's a challenge. I mentioned the good and the bad. Well, the bad, I just talked about it, is we're kind of stuck in a situation where parks in this recommendation is going to be considered as long-term, and that's in the 6 to 9 year category. The good news is that we have reached consensus on the task force that a metropolitan parks district is really the tool to examine further and pursue as a more sustainable method of funding for infrastructure for parks. As some of you know, we have a bond. We've had 2 of them in the last 20 years. Typically, that money is used up within just a few years, and then you have several years that you really don't have a lot of capital to work with, for project improvements, other than what the general fund has been, providing. The general fund money has actually gone up to some extent because the population has gone up, and when you have a larger tax base, you actually do have potentially more money available. But essentially, it's pretty much a shortfall. The capacity does exist for a parks district to potentially fund what's needed in the future. And so I do think that that's going to be a good instrument moving forward. Again, I don't like the timeline. I'm sure many of you don't either. But that's kind of what we're stuck with because of the nature of our social and economic dilemma that we're in right now. It is going to be something that we'll need to do a fair amount of analysis and examination of before something like that would be presented to the community, because what would happen, it would be a voter initiative into a ballot, and so it's going to probably take a couple years even to prepare for that. And so even though parks might be considered in the long range, it needs to get started with the analysis work prior to that, probably at least 2 years prior to that, and maybe 3. You know, I'm advocating if Parks is going to be in the long range of 6 to 9 years, I'm advocating that at least the analysis work through maybe another task force would get started perhaps in 3 years, possibly 4 years, maybe with the intention of at least trying to put a ballot initiative together by 6 years. So rather than 6 to 9 years, try and put it in place at the beginning of that range rather than at the end of the range. But a lot of that is going to be, you know, this has to be pretty flexible in many respects because there's just so much uncertainty in our economy. And it's uncertain, you know, how some of these other measures are going to play out as well. I don't want to get too much into transportation and facilities, but those are going to require some heavy lifting as well from the community. Transportation, we're zeroing in more on TAB, Transportation Advisory Board, for a sales tax to perhaps fund that. And also maybe some bonding. There's a couple different types of bonding to consider additionally. So I don't know. It's a lot to put in front of the community over the next 6 years, quite frankly, to fund all of the infrastructure needs that the city has. And so at least this is a start, and I think the task force recommendations you know, are a good platform to start from, and we'll just see how it plays out when we get down to the specifics.
Hey, Brad, Marlene has a question. Do you want questions now, or do you want to?
Yeah, I think I've kind of done my little talk here. Let's do a little Q&A here. So Marlene, you had something?
I have, if you'll bear with me, I have several questions, so I will
Sure.
cede the floor after other people. I think I'm going to start with the first thing that I heard earlier in your presentation, which, first of all, I appreciate you being a representative on this task force, and I know it's a lot of work and compromises always have to be made, so know that I understand that. I think the first question I have is, it sounded like a big decision-making criteria was how the community sort of force ranked or ranked the different priorities within, you know, whether it was transportation or facilities or parks. One thing that I've noticed in my 2 years on this park board is that a very small sample size of our community actually participates in any of that feedback. And I also find that we weight that feedback very heavily in our actions. I find that disproportionately has a negative impact on people like younger families or people that do not participate in these surveys. So my first question is, did we weigh in to that decision criteria the fact that that demographic typically is skewed?
Well, I think that everybody on the task force is aware of what you just said, but you have to also kind of go with what you have available to you in terms of
Totally
data.
disagree. I mean, if that's the reason we have a government, right, is to understand, if the, you know, we put people in place, especially as an elected officials, to make decisions on behalf because people don't have this kind of time. We cannot expect people to be this involved. That's why they elect people. So if we're putting a ton of prioritization of the tax dollars that people are spending, and maybe this is wrong, but it's my hunch, on a very small sample size that is not very diverse, then I think we're making huge mistakes with our tax dollars.
Well, you know, I wouldn't say everything is put into, you know, the data. That's just one component of it. I mean, you know, all of the people on the task force, you know, are heavily considered as well. I mean, they're all members of the community. They're all chairs of boards and commissions for the most part, so they have a pretty important say. And the council is really, the council and the mayor are the ones that actually have the final say on this. And so, you know,
It has just been my experience that that council and the mayor put a lot of weight on community feedback.
They
And
do.
that community feedback is typically not representative of the people of Issaquah broadly. And so I
I
have a
agree.
serious problem as a board member not putting parks at the back of the line based on that feedback. So I guess that's, and it's not a criticism of you, Brad, or anybody on the task force. It's just something I want to be on record saying as a pretty strong disagreement to the way that this is going down.
I hear you. I mean, I believe you, or believe me. I've had to make arguments, against this, the timeline aspect of it. But I mean, realistically, I also, to some extent, kind of agree. Being a member of this community now for 38 years, I also kind of agree that the city has not really kept up with the transportation needs probably as much as they have with parks. And so I don't really have any real objection to transportation taking the lead. Even so, I don't think it's just totally the survey that's there. Quite frankly, it'd be nice if we could do it all, but that's just not practical. I mean, you just can't go to the community with 3 large infrastructure priorities at the same time and expect that all of them are going to get passed. I mean, that's just, that's not, likely.
Yeah, I get it, and I know it's hard, and I know a couple other people have comments. Just before I sort of cede the floor, I have a couple other questions.
Okay.
I know we talked a lot about sort of the impact of, current world situations, on the community and funding. And, I know that is, reality in a lot of places. I would be curious with what research has been done about the actual impact to some of the higher paying taxpayers within our community. It's been at least my understanding that, a lot of the folks in our very privileged community are less impacted. Not that people in our community are not, but if we talk about the tax base, I would be curious. I also, are people willing to fund more? I think, are we just making that assumption, or do we have data that backs up that people are not willing to fund multiple things? I guess that would be the question.
Oh, I think that that's a huge uncertainty, and I think that remains to be seen over time. That's part of one of the things that'll have to be sorted out through a lot of analysis work, both for the transportation and parks. For any of this, it's going to require an awful lot more outreach, public meetings, more surveys, a lot of that to actually see how much the community is willing to support. This task force really can't answer that question. It was really the mission of the task force was really to determine priorities, come up with a bit of a framework, and discuss the various tools that are available. We're not actually, the task force is not making a recommendation that, yeah, just go do all of these things. It's just setting up the framework so that, there's going to be substantial need moving forward for all of these things to determine what the community really wants to do and what they would be willing to support.
Yep. And then I think my third point then becomes, it sounds like there is federal funding,
right,
with a deadline.
right.
Is there an opportunity for this group here on the call today to figure out what are our priorities and do some quick moving to make sure that we have proposals that are in shape and ready to get that funding? At least in my world, in the business context, sometimes the first person ready with a plan gets the first amount of funding. So what can we do to accelerate our timelines for that federal funding?
I think that's a good suggestion of something that we can talk about further, to be ready, when the council decides how much is going to be allocated to each of these priorities. So, I mean, I like that idea, and I do think that, it would be good to actually go through have a small group, perhaps, get involved with the 6-year CIP, really focus on some of the key areas that maybe could be accomplished over the next couple of years so that a plan could be in place. Wouldn't want to get too much ahead of yourself, though, until you have an idea on how much funding the council is going to allocate to parks. But having a rough draft of that, I think, would be good.
Yeah, I'd rather lead the witness. I think I would work differently than that. I would rather say, here are the things we can do quickly, that have a huge benefit to underserved people in our community and move with speed for the federal funding.
Well, I mean, I agree with it. It's pretty short timeline to try and get all this accomplished in a couple of years. I mean, and so I think it's, I think it's, pick what you can accomplish. And, some have actually advocated, that some of this could actually go into design work and stuff. I would probably be more inclined to advocate for things to actually accomplish rather than doing design work.
Agreed. I mean, quite frankly, let's start turfing some fields.
Well, it could be a number of things, and I like your idea, your suggestion for perhaps an ad hoc or a separate committee to actually take a look at, how we would spend a couple $1 million additionally. So, and rather than to wait until we get some funding, and then work on it, it really puts you behind the 8 ball if you do it that way. So that's something we can talk further, and Jeff and I can talk about that as well.
Thank you.
Anything
Appreciate the time. And again, just want to make sure that these comments, I definitely appreciate all the work that the task force is doing and know it's tough to prioritize.
Is that all, Marlene? Okay, thanks for that. Danielle, you have something?
I agree with everything Marlene has said, so I won't repeat all that. But I do think that when you're looking at doing an infrastructure project, the projects that we can do as a park department are really tangible, visible, and could make a difference, right? And so for the city, like that really could be, if you're looking to crank something out in a couple years, an infrastructure project might be like that money might just be a drop in the bucket, right? The other thing I like the idea that Marlene has, and I would really encourage Jeff to kind of think about that and start working on that. And then, I guess I'm very disappointed to hear that parks kind of got pushed into the long-term project funding. One of the reasons why people are satisfied with our parks, perhaps, is because we have done incremental improvements, right? So we had a park bond in something like 2006 and then another one in 2013. We're already past due for one if we were to keep that same rhythm going. And if we wait for 6 more years, and then the projects take time after that, people are not going to be satisfied. So it's disappointing to me to think that that the next time that we're going to be able to really make significant improvements to our park system might be pushed that far. So I'm hoping that there will be an opportunity for us to advocate to council and the mayor to shift that timing because that came from a task force. So I'm assuming that they'll, take that under advisement, but also make their own decisions.
Well, I'm disappointed as well, Danielle. And like I said, approaching a lot of headwind in this task force because of things that I've already talked about in terms of how this timeline was, established. And but when you only have one person of 11, you can only do so much. So I do think that any individually board members that would like to advocate to the council or to the mayor to speed that up a little bit, I think would be welcomed. I have voiced what I can, but I think more support would only help that.
What is the
I
appropriate
didn't
forum?
Go ahead, Danielle, and then I'll get back to you, Marlene.
I did not want that was not a criticism of you, Brad. I understand what you were working on. But to me, strategically, it makes sense for the city to actually do projects and funding where they know they've had past support, historic support, and check that off the box. Transportation, we've been struggling with that since I've moved to Issaquah almost 20 years ago, and we haven't figured it out, right? So that's a big project, and it's, anyway, go ahead, Marlene.
Oh, my question was, what is the right forum to do that advocating?
Twofold. I would say you could write emails to city council and mayor expressing your viewpoint, and you can also get in front of the city council at meetings during public comments, to voice your advocacy and opinion. I mean, those are the two areas to approach the city with it.
Is there a time when the city, can you remind us, you probably said this in your introductory remarks, but do we know when this is going to city council?
March 7th. That's next Monday.
So if I can add to that, Brad, and great discussion, and I don't want to interrupt, but here I am interrupting. I'd love to, I've got a couple of observations and thoughts. I'd love to share those after everybody discusses. I understand, Brad, if I could add, March 7th is the task force presenting their recommendation to the council. Council won't be discussing that night. They'll just be receiving the info. And then the following study session on March 15th, council will begin some degree of discussion on the capital financing recommendation. So just note that both the 7th and the 15th will be, I think, some important, probably the 15th more than anything will be some important, an important opportunity if any of you wanted to share your thoughts as residents.
Yeah, and it's probably best to advocate within those two meetings, because if you wait until when the council is going to make their decision, which may be like first part of April, then it's kind of already too late. They've already got everything baked in by that time. So I agree with Jeff. Actually, that 15th might actually be the best time to do it, because that's when they're really going through a study session and trying to decide on, everything that's been presented to them. On the 7th, it's going to be the initial recommendation from the task force, and that'll be the first time a lot of the council members will hear it. And so it would maybe make more sense to them after they've had a chance to get the recommendation, and then that following week, start digesting it. Any other comments or questions from anybody? Danielle?
So do we know, with respect to the federal funds, like who's going to decide how those are spent? Is that also city council, and do we know what the timing for that decision is?
That's city council, and don't have a timeline of that, but given the short fuse of it, my guess is that will be probably a part of that study session. Because, it's within our recommendations, in terms of utilization of those ARPA funds. So my guess is that will also be a part of the discussion on the 15th that Jeff mentioned. And because this needs to be done by 2024, my guess is they're going to want to make a decision on that by April, so that they can get an allocation of those funds so that department heads can actually start rolling with projects. That's not something that they can wait too long on. Jeff's wanting to bite at the bit on that, I guess. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, no, I think the conversation starts on the 15th. I think as council begins to deliberate and get a sense of, all right, how do they want to invest those ARPA funds? I think part of that conversation will be trying to understand what their priorities or goals are. Is there a process with which they want to get an understanding of what types of projects, what specific projects are good candidates for those funds, how they want to prioritize and choose amongst those practical, realistic capital projects that can get done. So all that to say, I think the conversation starts on the 15th. I don't know that there would be a specific directive. I think it's probably a discussion, a council level discussion, a council level decision that goes into the spring, into April and May as well. So more to come.
I'm just going to point out one more controversy. Jeff and I have talked about it. I might as well tell the board about it as well, because it's a little bit of a hot item for me that I've been pushing back on. And not been ultra successful because we don't have consensus from the task force is that the tool of a parks district actually has the ability to fund as much as $10 million a year towards parks. And unfortunately, some within the task force and maybe even within the city are looking at potentially rather than having the Parks District only fund additional things that are currently unfunded in the future, to potentially be utilized to supplant some of the existing money that is currently being allocated from the general fund towards parks. I don't know if I said that right so people can understand what I'm saying, but I'm pretty irate that that's even something that somebody's willing to consider. Because that's kind of a shell game. And there are several of us on the task force that specifically pointed out that's a shell game. The community will never accept it, and you're playing with fire to go down that road. So what I've been pushing for, and others as well, is that any parks district would only be for future unfunded infrastructure. Rather than to replace any existing general fund money that's currently being allocated by the city. Because it just doesn't make any sense to add more taxation to the community, for parks, and then really not get any additional benefit for that. So I don't know, that's an ongoing issue, and the last recommendation letter I just read today, that they're really still saying that that's up in the air. And so I don't know, that's another headwind. Jeff?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that one up too, Brad. I think you all as park board know, and I'll be fully transparent, I had the chance to share what a park district is to the capital financing group, shared that same information to all of you. And within that research and within that analysis I provided, I shared best practice and some of the successful cities that have recently looked at this new type of park district funding. And the best practice being before that went to voters, as that went to voters, there was an interlocal agreement between the city and the would-be park district. That interlocal agreement sort of was a way to transparently identify this would not be funding that would look to supplant. This would be funding that would look to augment existing parks and recreation funding. And so I've been very transparent with the task force, with all of you, and would be just as transparent with the community. More discussion to be had, but if a park district is something this community wants to discuss, talk about, begin to frame up, begin to create some definition, I, as the Parks and Community Services Director, would highly recommend that best practice. And I've shared this with other city staff as well, that I would not advise any type of park district pursuit that would look like supplanting existing funds so that funds could go elsewhere. Because simply put, that's not a best practice, and communities that have been as successful with park districts have done the exact opposite, and that's sort of guaranteeing in an interlocal agreement that existing funding for parks will remain in parks, and that this park district is a way of augmenting, adding value to the investment the community is already making in that important infrastructure.
Thanks for adding that, Jeff. Just one more headwind, just wanted to point that out so everybody's aware of it. There's a lot of years ahead of us here to try and get this park district thing figured out. So it's good to at least flush out what the main controversies are, and then we can work on it over time. Any other comments or questions? Not seeing any. Thanks for all that. I've extended the time a little bit, but this is an important issue. And this is going to be the last time for us to talk about it before, this goes before council. So I am well aware of and supportive of things that Marlene and Darlene and Danielle have said. And so it's a matter that, again, if you make additional comments, I think that would be helpful.
Hey, Brad, can I add a couple things super fast to this topic?
Yep.
First off, just thank you. Certainly on behalf of staff, I think the rest of the park board, thank you so much for being a voice and being the park board rep in this really, really important conversation. To Marlene, Danielle, thanks for your feedback. I think as you said it, Marlene, to think of a forced ranking of these buckets of infrastructure, I think any vibrant, healthy community, public transportation infrastructure, public park infrastructure, public facility infrastructure are all essential to a vibrant community. So to try and rank or put one as more important than the other can become really, really hard. I guess as a staff, as I've observed this, this feels like a really, really important step of a start of some really, really important conversations about capital funding. I would agree with what Brad shared. I think parks investments that have been made in this community over the last 20, 30 years have demonstrated progress. But I would add, and I think the feedback we've heard from the community in our park strategic plan, they haven't kept up. There's pent up need and interest for our park system to serve some really, really important city park amenities that those investments haven't kept up either. And so I guess I would just put a framework around as this recommendation moves forward. And again, Brad, the work that you did with the task force to have a group of residents talking about this and taking the long view, and now it going to council, this is good. It's not going to be it's not going to be just this spring that decisions are made. This is hopefully setting a framework for more conversation about how you as residents want to invest in all elements of important public infrastructure, and not feeling like one has to be or somehow is forced to be more important than the other. Just thought I'd add those comments. Thanks so much, Brad, again.
You bet. Thank you. Danielle, something?
Sorry. Yeah, before we move on, I'm wondering, I mean, often there have been times in the past where we have, as a board, provided comment to city council and to the mayor, because that's who we're like technically advised. And is this one of those, topics that would be worthy of weighing in as a board, or does that put you in a kind of a delicate position since you were part of a task force? And maybe I just pose that as something to think about, and we can talk about it at our next meeting too. But
I don't think we have time to talk about it at the next meeting, right? Like, I think we need to figure out, like, I'd take, Brad's lead on what he thinks is the right thing to do is here based on being part of the task force. But I think I'm hearing that maybe there's some dissent from this group in what's happening. I'd be interested to hear what the rest of the council thinks, since Danielle and I'm the only ones talking along with Brad.
I would actually say that everybody here is probably on the same page in terms of not agreeing with the timeline that's being presented. Whether or not the board as a collective force would have any further impact than what's already being presented by myself in this task force, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I suppose that's something that we can can think about here and perhaps, present at, collectively on the 15th or something. That would probably be the time to do it. Um, I, I don't know. I don't know how the council would look at that. They may, I've already kind of voiced that. I've also voiced that we've had an ad hoc committee that we've kind of been, already kind of on the side talking about this as well. And it really comes down to, pushing the timeline, and whether or not the collective board can have maybe more of an impact than just me on the task force, to shorten up that timeline. I don't know. It would be worth the effort, I suppose. I don't
I
know.
think the task force probably, I mean, they're looking at this, the city council is going to look at this through a different lens probably than the task force. And it might be that some of the points that have been raised in this meeting and Brad, by you to the task force might resonate with city council. I would think it's worth a shot. I can't imagine us being in a position where, we're waiting 10 years to do any new, like any major capital improvements to our parks.
Well, I agree.
That's
That's kind of the bottom
that-
line. That's the bottom line, isn't it, Danielle? And I agree with that.
Yeah.
With that, because you're right. We're frankly we're due for another bond measure right now,
Yeah.
or within
If
the
it's
next
just
year.
underwater even before this rain, like we have Little League starting and the dugouts are underwater even before this rain even happened. Like we've got a lot of issues here in parks that, don't need to wait.
I mean, what does everybody think? I mean, do we want to have a collective park board initiative here to go in front of the front of council? I mean, I don't even what that would look like. Essentially, it would probably be me, as chair presenting something on the, on behalf of the entire board, rather than just me presenting something just based on me. And so whether that would have more of an impact to the council in their decision-making process, I don't know. I mean, it wouldn't hurt. I don't know. You have any thoughts on that, Jeff?
Yeah, a couple. I appreciate hearing the discussion, the conversation. Brad, perhaps if you and a couple other board members want to sort of form an ad hoc, I think drafting something that you could share to the rest of the park board, that would be presented to council on the 15th. What I'm hearing is not necessarily, pitchforks and total disagreement with the task force. It's more, I think, could be presented as enthusiastic. Hey, if consideration of a park district is something we want to do as the park board, we think it's important to do that sooner than later. Right? I mean, that's what I guess one way I would suggest phrasing a narrative in what I'm hearing tonight.
Well, quite frankly, I can do that on Wednesday. I mean, I can talk to the task force. The mayor is going to be there. There's already, 2 members of the city council on the task force. I can convey on our last day of recommendation, which is on Wednesday the 2nd, that collectively the board, feels that for these certain reasons, the timeline for parks, needs to be shortened up. Again, I've already voiced that myself, and it hasn't, gone as far as I would have liked. Whether or not me making the statement to the task force that, now that we've talked about it, there's more support from the board.
As an advisory group, and thanks for that, Brad. I was going to add that same suggestion, that with the meeting on with the task force on the 2nd, if you all as a park board wanted to take an advisory vote tonight to give voice to just that, sort of this enthusiastic, hey, if a park district's to be considered, let's consider it sooner than than later. Let's begin that exploration work. If that's something you all want to say yes to, Brad, you could then carry that as an advisory vote, just saying, hey, we talked about this as a group, and here's where the park board is presenting another group of residents who are perhaps sharing a little more enthusiasm than 6 to 9 years.
And concern, frankly, right, with waiting for 6 to 9 years.
Right.
So I mean, I'm enthusiastic to get it started, and I'm also really concerned with the proposed timeline.
I agree.
I leave that for your discussion. Yep.
So I guess I would just say, and really it's about timeline is what everybody's having issues with, right? Wanting to move this up the chain faster. I mean, if somebody wants to make a motion that the board would make a recommendation that be shortened up, then that's something I can take to the task force on Wednesday. I think the sooner, and Marlene kind of touched on this, the sooner that something like this is presented, the better, because otherwise things get baked in and things become in writing parts of recommendations, and then it's a lot harder to change them after that occurs. So I mean, it's, our opportunity of any hope to change is now, this week, not a month from now. And not to say that, the council couldn't be persuaded with, further down the line. I just, my feeling is once things get baked in, it's a lot harder to change it later on.
Can I just ask one clarifying question before we do the motions?
Mm-hmm.
And, so the 6 to 9 year timeline is really for the park district. And so what we would be thinking about is, as opposed to force ranking everything, it seems to me my proposal would be that you would prioritize sort of across the different functions versus saying we're going to do everything for transportation, this thing, and then everything for facilities and everything for parks. My perspective is a little more that you would prioritize within each of those 3 top things and have different timelines across, sort of in a matrix. Is that kind of what's happening, or is that
well, one of the reasons why things are,
6 to 9?
One of the reasons why things are being jockeyed a bit is because you can't go, for instance, you can't put together a ballot initiative for transportation, parks, and facilities and, distribute all of that on one ballot initiative. Likely all of them would fail. I mean, and so that's why it's hard to kind of put everything together in the same timeline. Ideally, that would be nice, but I think when you got to go to the voters and get approval, they're more apt to just approve one thing at a time rather than 3 things. And if you put 3 things to the voters and a couple of them fail, it may be difficult, the year after or even 2 years after to try and bring it up again. So it really does have to take some real thought, as to timing of how you put this in front of the voters.
Helpful.
That's a challenge.
Could we hear from Chris and Ruben and Jonathan and
Zach?
whoever else I'm missing? Yeah, and Zach.
Yeah, I'm sorry for being late. It took me about 10 minutes to get into the meeting. I've lost track of the timeline, but my concern is the same as everybody else. How far out do you put this? And I guess I don't know what a decent timeline is, but I would think it'd be less than 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, I'll agree with what's been said. I have concerns with that timeline. I'm also concerned that I think we've generally done a good job through bond measures and all the other work that's happened to kind of create infrastructure that's already in place now, and to just kind of defund feels like it takes a lot of the forward progress and momentum away from, I think, what has overall been a very positive program for the community.
Any thoughts, Chris, Zach?
If we're unable to push up the timeline on getting the park district, would it be possible, I suppose, to pursue something like the bond measure again as a means?
I guess we talked about that a little bit. My thoughts about that is, if you were to put together a bond measure, it would probably not enable you then to put together a park district, at least for a very long time, because people are not going to want to vote for both. And if we're looking for something more sustainable long-term for funding for parks, a park district seems to make better sense than to go for a bond. That's just my thought on it.
Yeah, the mechanics, Zach, of a bond measure is you're basically putting money on the credit card, right? So you might, the year that it's voted on, you get capital money up front, but then the community, the residents are paying off the credit card for it's typically a 20-year bond, right? So that there's an additional property tax payment for 20 years after that bond. And so as Brad was saying, I think the task force really took a look at not just the funding type, but the mechanics of it. Whereas a district is not putting money on the credit card. A district is sort of paying as you go. You're getting an annual allotment every year and investing that in capital or the identified projects year by year, as opposed to the credit card approach, as I call it.
Is the prioritization or deprioritization, as we might be experiencing it, is that strictly for bond options or is that for general fund spending?
I'm sure not. I don't know what you mean by the deprioritization, Chris.
Well, by the task force saying, parks is doing great, so let's not spend that money now. Let's not prioritize parks now. That's essentially what was said. Is that applying to general fund spending or?
No, that's not applying to general fund spending. That's applying to new funding. So essentially what, currently, the next couple of years is kind of already funded by general fund, and 2022 it's 1.5 million, 2023 it's 1.3 million. So I mean, they've already kind of established general funds for capital improvements in parks. They say roughly that they could potentially even fund up to $2 million a year from the general fund for parks. But, we're still $4.5 million a year behind that funding that we don't have. And that's why we're kind of going through this exercise.
I mean, it's going to be hard to convince anyone that this is going to be somehow more important than what everybody's screaming about, which is traffic. And, people aren't screaming about parks, thankfully. So we might say something at the next two council meetings, present something. The effect might be limited, because again, there is a group of people with pitchforks and torches. And so maybe we try to pair this up with, two other ideas that were brought here, which is let's make our wish list and try to be out front of the federal funding, right away. And I'm sure Jennifer has that list just waiting in a folder. And then the other thing is just really advocate for saying, look, we realize that you're going to focus, council, you're going to focus on transportation, and we get why, but we don't want to be left in a situation where people are screaming about parks in 2 more years. So then we need to accelerate the park district effort.
I like what Chris is saying. I think the thing that's interesting about traffic or about transportations and parks is transportation is always something you're trying to get to neutral. Like nobody's happy about traffic or transportation. Like you're trying to get to like baseline versus parks is a satisfier. And so if I'm in the city council or if I'm the mayor, I need to prioritize, yes, I need to get to good or get to neutral on traffic, But what is it that makes Issaquah? Issaquah is the parks, and people move here because it's beautiful and all of those things. So it's like you start ignoring the satisfier. Like that is actually more dangerous, in my opinion, to a community than ignoring like the dissatisfier. Because the only thing that's going to happen with traffic is you're going to make some improvements and it's going to be okay for a couple of years, but no one's going to like it anyways, right? It's just going to be maybe a get to neutral, maybe if you're wildly successful. But man, you make some improvements to parks, your community is happy with you, right? And city council and the mayor, you know, not that they just care about that for people to be happy with them, but they want the community to be happy. And so it's like, how are we focusing both on the community dissatisfiers, transportation, while augmenting, I think to me, that's sort of the marketing of this is the satisfier is the parks. You start ignoring it, you're going to have a different problem.
I agree, Marlene. You know, one of the things.
I know I don't have to convince you guys. I'm just trying to figure out how do we convince other people.
Well, and one of the things that I try to point out, even when we were arguing about priorities, is that a lot of times transportation, people might be filling out surveys that they're frustrated with transportation through the city, but in reality, most of anything that the city does is not going to resolve that because it's more of a regional issue. And so, you know, a lot of the funds that go, you know, is kind of, you know, dealing with some of the transportation mobility issues to make things a little better, but you're still going to end up having a transportation problem even after all of that, because regional issues are still going to drive the, you know, the delays. But I didn't get very far with that argument, and so it has been voiced.
Well, how about if we have like a simple motion that the park board enthusiastically supports exploring the park district? Is it Metropolitan Park District or just the Park District?
Called Metropolitan Park District.
Exploring a Metropolitan Park District without delay. And so we're really just supporting, you know, starting to look at that, you know, starting that process. So instead of delaying, waiting for 4 years to do that, is that strong enough for people, or do we think we need to say that we need to, that we're opposed to the delay, or, you know, classifying the timing of the park district as a long-term priority?
I think it has to be put more into a medium term rather than long-term priority, not just when you get started on reviewing it, because you can review it next month, but it's not practical to do that if the city is not supported to do anything for 6 years, because that, you know, you're spinning your wheels for 6 years.
So it's a midterm priority is what we would want. So we would want to support exploring the park district without delay and classifying, what would you say, the funding
into midterm rather than long-term.
as a midterm rather than long-term category.
Correct, right. So you want to eloquently put that together in a one-liner as a motion?
Yeah. I'm a little bit not sure about how to do the so we're classifying, is it the financing or the funding or like the projects? Like what exactly is in that midterm, long-term, like what is it that we're?
Midterm would be funding available.
Timing. I think it's a timing qualifier, right?
Right.
Timing of initiating or basically taking to voters in the midterm as opposed to long term.
Right.
Okay. So I'd like to move that I'm not really sure, we don't really have something we're acting on, but like that the park board enthusiastically supports exploring the Metropolitan Park District without delay and and taking that to the voters in the midterm rather than long term. Does that make sense, or would that make sense to people who don't know what we're talking about?
Danielle, what am I hearing you say? And moving up the timing of
Moving up the timing. Mm-hmm.
from long term to midterm, something like that.
Yes.
And the
Isn't
motion is that the
real-time
park board,
wordsmithing so much fun? Oh.
the
Okay,
motion
I'm
is
gonna
that
type it in
the
the
park
chat.
board. Sorry, the motion is that the park board will advocate or
Yeah.
encourage city council to.
Do you want to say recommend to city council?
Recommends.
That's
Yeah.
stronger.
I'm gonna put it in the chat here. The park board recommends that.
Make sure to type it to everyone when you do it.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry, you guys.
Total typing amnesty too, if there's a couple of
Typos.
yeah.
She's typing that up, Brad.
Mhm.
Is there a place that we can find from a transportation perspective what we would actually spend money on doing to improve? Like, just as a voter, I'd love to understand, like, if we want to put that in short term and spend a bunch of money on it, what would it actually do?
Well, transportation has a CIP set up much like Parks does.
Okay.
And so that's where that information is
I
over
just
the.
find that on the Issaquah site.
Yeah, so Marlene, within the 6-year capital improvement plan, the 6-year CIP, there's a transportation category along with the parks category. That 6-year transportation category is informed by, I think it's the acronym is the TIP, the Transportation Improvement Plan, that's done every year. So the TIP would be, I guess, the parallel to the park strategic plan.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm not against transportation, guys. Like, I don't want to come across like that. I just, want to understand what it is.
Well, on this board, we're advocating for parks, right? So I think it's okay to be in favor of transportation and parks, and it can't be one or the other, right?
Right.
Okay, I've sent in the chat. I don't think that the last part of it says the park board recommends that the city council commences the exploratory phase of the Metropolitan Park District without delay and move up the timing of the task force. I should probably say recommendation from the long term to midterm.
That looks good, Danielle. Is that a motion? Is that a motion, Danielle?
It's a motion, yes.
Anyone like to second that? Chris seconded it. Okay, all in favor, please raise your hand. That is unanimous. Thank you. I will take that to the task force on Wednesday.
Thanks.
I think we've kind of beat that one up a good bit, a lot longer than I expected, about 45 minutes longer than we had planned on. So sorry to make you wait so much, Matt, but this is all good stuff for you to know about, I suppose, what's going on behind the scene. Huh? So that being said, Matt, maybe you can lighten things up with all the good news about Green Issaquah.
Sounds good. Thanks, Brad. So yeah, welcome. I'm Matt Meckler. I'm our Parks Operations Supervisor. Kind of talk a little bit about our Green Issaquah program that was launched in 2020. And I know Melissa has a couple slides she's going to share with us. The first one's just kind of some of our 2021 impacts that we had. You know, like I said, the Green Issaquah program was kicked off in 2020, but with COVID issues, we really didn't have the opportunity to do a lot of volunteer events. But we did have an opportunity to start to train some of our forest stewards to help steward some of our open space lands. So with that being said, you know, we got about 15 people trained to become forest stewards. And out of those 15 people, we were able to get several of our park and open space sites kind of adopted by those stewards. So one of the, here's kind of the list of the different places. So we have Bernston Park, Emily Darst Park, the East Sunset Way Trailhead, Northwest Dogwood property, the Rainier Trail south, kind of from the community center towards 2nd Avenue, Harvey Manning Park at Talus, and then also Talus Open Space. All had stewards that adopted those. And we've already had several events in 2020 that helped steward some of those properties. So a lot of you may have been to those, or maybe even participated in some of those events, or been to those parks or trailheads and seen some of the good work that's being done. We've had about 1.75 new acres in restoration in 2021. About 309 volunteers were engaged. 113 of those were youth, for a total of about 876 hours. And then we were able to get 3,589 plants in the ground. And of those, 3,369 were trees. So pretty impressive numbers for, you know, not even being able to go at full capacity with all of our events. You know, a lot of the volunteer events were just limited to, 15 people or less, I think, originally. Some of them were only like 5, I think, when COVID was in full swing. And we've been able to increase some of those events now to 30 people. So great things. We have some recent events that just took place. We're at East Sunset Way. We had one at Bernston Park a couple weeks ago. We just had a brand new event. One of our stewards who adopted Emily Darst Park had their first event over along the Pickering Trail. So if any of you walk along the Pickering Trail, ride your bike, you may have seen some huge piles of blackberries that were just from an event this weekend. And they're actually going to be holding another event coming up here on this coming Saturday too. So to do some more invasive removal and in preparation for a planting event, probably in early April, somewhere around there. So that'll be exciting. I guess we'll go to the next slide too, Melissa, if you could. Yeah, this one's a little, I don't know if everyone can see, it's a little small, but the way the Green Issaquah program was developed is there's management units. So all of Issaquah, the whole 1,540 acres was kind of evaluated to determine, where we need to do work. And so the two kind of squares there, the top one shows us the acreage. The kind of the upper left-hand corner shows us the amount of acres that are actually in really good shape. They have high habitat, low invasives, and then kind of just if you go diagonally down from that, where that 72 is, those are acres that have a lot of invasives and low habitat value that need to be restored. So when you look at all of our 1,500 acres that we have, plus a lot of them are in that pretty good zone there to where they're in good shape. That some of them just need a little bit of management, some of them need a little bit of invasive removal, some of them need just some additional plantings and monitoring. And then as we continue to train more forest stewards and get more of our acreage adopted by stewards, we're hoping that the numbers that you see kind of in that upper left-hand corner, those numbers start to get bigger, and the numbers down below start to get smaller just as we continue to do work on those different areas throughout the city. With that being said, like I mentioned, we have the Emily Darst event coming up this Saturday. We're also in the process of working on our Earth Day, Arbor Day event, which we've had to delay the last couple of years because of COVID. It's also a requirement of our Tree City USA program, which the Arbor Day Foundation has waived. I think they'll probably be bringing that back this year. So we're looking at sometime in April to do our Arbor Day event. We also work with, a variety of partners too. One of them is DIA. They have their Keep Issaquah Beautiful Day coming up April 23rd. So that'll hopefully do some stuff in the downtown corridor of Issaquah. I know they've branched out and done some work at Emily Darce Park and some of the other areas too. And then starting in probably June or July, we're going to start another round of forest steward training again and recruitment. So we'll be hopefully we'll be able to do it in person. The last few times we've just been doing it virtual. So training some more stewards to become adopting some more of our park sites. So that'll be fun. So I don't know if there's any questions or if Jeff, you wanted to add anything to what we were kind of talking about earlier.
Boy, just a couple of thoughts, Matt. Excellent work. Thanks, Melissa. I think you can stop sharing for the time being. Boy, yeah, I guess a couple of thoughts. First, just hats off to Matt. As Matt mentioned, Green Issaquah, as this has been a priority to get going. 2021 really represented our first full year of implementation and operationalizing this. In that effort, Matt is serving as the lead in that work and working with Forterra. Doing first year of implementation in the midst of the pandemic is quite interesting, but to know we already have 15 stewards trained up says a lot for a first year. I think just a couple thoughts on those two graphics. That infographic is something we want to share with you in the community every year. And we should not be surprised to see those numbers start to incrementally increase as more stewards are trained up. We're going to have another steward training here in 2022. Melissa Ching is actually going to be giving really direct support in this project and program as well as we're growing capacity in 2022. So Matt and Melissa will be sort of our two key staff in this effort moving forward. This is an important priority, and this not only Green Issaquah, but really being a steward of the urban forest, being the best steward we can of the urban forest that the city owns as a first step is a high priority as well. I guess I add that in context to the prior conversation we had, which was really, really important as we look into the future. And as this community thinks about investing into its park system, these 1,500 acres of open space are really, really important, both for environment and habitat, but also for recreational use. And so those 1,500 acres don't just take care of themselves once they're bought. They really take active stewardship and active investment. And so Issaquah's park system is amazing. I think it greatly defines the livability in this community, and it's really balanced in that the system is both an important buffer, an important definer of the Alps and the urban forest, and sort of that passive recreation that is, I think, so key to this community, just as making investments into the active recreation priorities of this community. So I just say that as maybe a bit of a bridge between this update on Green Issaquah and why this work is so important to us as a department. And again, Forterra is not our only strategy. Those numbers represent the great work and our partnership with Forterra, but in that is also our partnered work and our continued partnered work with Mountains to Sound Greenway, with Washington Conservation Corps, and other means and other strategies that we've taken to make sure we're positioning ourselves to be the best steward we can of our city-owned urban forest. So big thanks, Matt. Huge thanks. This is a big step.
Yeah, you're welcome. One thing I forgot to mention is right now we have about 1,600 trees that should be delivered here maybe by the end of this week, and then another couple hundred that are in our nursery. So all those plants will be plants that we'll be planting this spring and then into next fall too, as we continue to have more stewardship events too. So our numbers, like Jeff said, hopefully that 3,369 trees that we planted this year will be a little bit higher, or in 2020 will be a little bit higher in 2022. So.
Hey, Matt, I know it's kind of still early in the program, but is there any kind of a expectation on an annualized basis to actually put together work plans in terms of what areas to work on throughout the year? Is that going to get established that way, or is it kind of dependent upon the amount of stewards you have in place?
Kind of a little bit of both. So like I mentioned, the whole Green Issaquah plan, it breaks everything into management units. And those management units are kind of color coded, like the way the chart is too. So there's some areas in, Bernstein Park, it might have one little pocket in the corner that really needs a lot more work than some other areas that are looking pretty good. So the focus is to work on those high priority areas where we can get a lot of bang for our buck. We can get the invasives out of there, get some native vegetation in there, and get that parcel looking really good. So it's a combination of both, I think. And then focusing on those areas where there are a lot of high invasives and we can make great impact. And then also, where our stewards want to help out too. Some of them have certain passions or live in neighborhoods that they want to work close to where, this open space is. So it's a little bit of both.
Have anything more for us, Matt?
That was kind of it. That was just kind of the real quick overview of 2021.
Anybody have any questions or comments for Matt? Not seeing anybody other than I saw a quick hand from Jeff. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, for context too, I know Connie had some public comment. I was going to save it for director's report, but maybe her comment about what she saw in I think it's the Issaquah Daily article that was listed for carbon credits. Thank you, Connie, for those comments. And I think her question pertained to, I think it was referenced that those funds would just go into the general fund. I can share that as the department leading that effort, and Jen and I will continue to work with finance, the intent is for those funds to be in a place that they can be invested directly into not only Bergsma or the Harvey Manning property, but other open space and Green Issaquah investments, and not just be absorbed into the general fund. So we'll certainly be following up with finance if and when that sale happens. The sale has not happened yet, but if and when the sale happens and those funds are provided to the city, that they are in a location that can be invested directly into our city urban forest.
Not seeing anything else. Matt, appreciate your patience for waiting for us, and especially with the presentation tonight. So nice job that you and the team are doing, and keep at it. Really good work.
All right. Thanks, Brad. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate the time.
Thanks, Matt. So that puts us into Jennifer. You're going to talk about Citywide Athletic.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Melissa, can you give me privilege to share my screen here?
Okay, you should be all set.
All right, thanks. So hopefully I can go a little quickly through the presentation and be respectful of time, knowing we still have other agenda items ahead of us. Is everyone seeing?
Yep.
My PowerPoint?
Yep, okay. That's good.
Great. So tonight I'm here to talk about our citywide athletic field assessment that we are going to be doing. The goal of this project is for us to review all publicly owned fields within City of Issaquah city limits. Fields that are publicly managed include obviously the City of Issaquah, but also Issaquah School District, and Lake Sammamish State Park. There's really two big topics that we're looking at in this field assessment is how are these fields currently serving the community, but also how can these fields better serve the community in the future? The scope of work is kind of twofold here. We're doing an analysis and current needs assessment. We're going to be looking at the condition of the fields. We're looking at field accessibility, parking, ADA access, all of the things, even existing agreements, because there's a lot of fields that have agreements with certain clubs and user groups for an extended period of time where booking and access might take priority for that club over other people being able to use those fields. We're also looking at ball control, service life of some of the existing infrastructure, surface quality, how flat is the field, the planarity, what are the current drainage situations, reliability, and other infrastructure, like does the field have seating, lights, things like that. We're also going to be looking at field program capacity, what different fields are utilizing, different sports are utilizing those fields, sorry, and review the usage, access to scheduling, but also the hierarchy of some of the sport uses, that are currently existing on those fields. And we're also going to be engaging with league representatives to really learn more from each of the leagues. We don't know what that engagement's going to look like right now, but more to come on that as we get closer to doing this. We're also going to be taking a look at that other twofold piece is what are future needs and opportunities. We're going to be looking at some change, both in population growth, but also in recreational trends. We're going to be looking at each of the field locations, what a highest field quality, given that field condition, might be. Recommend some potential renovations. These are not going to be formal design plans, just a rough overlay as to what could possibly fit in any given space. And again, remember, this is also maybe making recommendations on property that the city doesn't have the opportunity to manage, maybe, working with a school district. And also taking a look at scheduling capacity. If change were to happen on these fields, how would that also impact potential scheduling capacity and access? A few items to note, there are some fields that are currently under construction with some of the new schools that the school district is doing. We've got a new middle school and a new high school going in. Lake Sammamish State Park is also actively engaged in a master plan update right now, an environmental impact statement. When we had an internal meeting, we did talk to school district staff as well as Lake Sammamish State Park staff in order that we're not getting ahead of any recommendations that would be coming out of state parks. But do know they have been looking at field overlays, and we'll have some options that are coming out to the community as part of their environmental impact process. And we're just working with what information they are providing for us. We also have, as I mentioned earlier, some fields have some existing agreements and priority access to them. And so we're going to be looking at that. We had our first kickoff meeting for the scope of work on the 16th, which seems like yesterday, but it was actually almost 2 weeks ago now. So as we get ready to kick off this, just wanted to really bring this to you, see if there's some other items you would like us to take a look at as part of this work. This is really, again, a very high level assessment, looking at what is currently existing, knowing that what it could be is a very high level look, given a lot of unknowns, about site and future development and things like that. So I would like to open this back up to the board and ask if you have any feedback for us and if you have any further questions.
Can you take down the screen so I can see everyone?
Yes.
So questions, anybody? Danielle, you got something?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I was having some technical issues during the beginning of your presentation, so you might have answered this already. But lighting, like, is that one of the categories? So we know, like, like what are available, like length of day that a field can be programmed.
Yes, as we look at the fields that have existing lighting as part of that capacity, how late those lights can operate definitely will be part of that overall look at how those fields are being used and where some of those access points are.
And you'll do that with the district ones as well, because some are lit and some
Correct.
aren't. And okay.
Correct. And granted, some of their fields aren't even scheduled to be completed down the road, but we know what improvements are going to be occurring on those properties. So we're able to forecast there'll be a brand new field in those locations. So
Got it. And do we have, are we looking at any other like pieces of land that either the city owns or that the school district owns, like or another public entity, like in our area? Like, is there anything else that's out there that will be looked at other than the state park?
no, right now we are currently looking at what are existing play fields. We'll say we're looking at play fields even at some of the elementary schools that may have sand lots right now. How could those potentially be improved and provide some recreational access, maybe in ways that they haven't before. So we will be taking a look at those as well.
And can you speak a little bit about how this is going to overlay with the master planning process at Tibbetts in particular? Because it seems like if we're looking at that high level, like what Tibbetts could do, like how is that going to work with the master planning process?
Great question. We're working with J.A. Hogan, who had the privilege of having some of the access to information about some of the geotechnical and environmental issues out there. I think we have directed him to do this work independent of that master planning process. So really just taking a look at what's happening out there right now. And then as we look at the master planning and we look at all of our fields throughout the system, that's where we can start looking at some of those different capacity issues or uses that may be transferred to another site or location as we start looking at the whole puzzle citywide rather than just one individual piece of that puzzle.
And okay, so sorry, one more question. Is there going to be an opportunity in this process for citizens or the park board to weigh in as far as like because we have a field doesn't mean that it's like optimally used or is like works well, right, for a particular sport. I'm thinking, for example, we have 2 Little League fields up in Central Park that are the fields are too small, really, right, to be like maximum like used. So I know that you guys are aware of a lot of that, but probably there might be some things that other people are aware of. Is there a point in this process that input will be sought, or is it just
yes, we will be
factual?
We'll be engaging with the athletic groups, doing some engagement with them. I don't know what that engagement is going to look like yet. As we get there, we'll formulate that. But yes, we'll be looking at how people are currently using those sites, what use issues they may be having, so we can be informed going forward as we make high-level recommendations for those spaces. Maybe those spaces, maybe those fields, those uses end up somewhere else, and maybe those become a different type of use in that location. We'll have to see again as we start looking at the bigger puzzle piece, but yes, we will be engaging and learning about what all the hiccups and what's working well at each location, but also what's not. And, as we look at these properties, like the school district, we had that conversation with them that, hey, we might say this isn't working well. And they're like, we understand. So that was a really good conversation to be having with them as we're looking at how we can provide athletic needs across all venues, across all field spaces available for all different sports and activities.
If I could just add real quick to that, Jen, thanks for that. I think also in your question, Danielle, is we engage with both the district and the state park. And I would say in that kickoff meeting on the 16th, both agencies were there and are definitely leaning in to this effort, which is very encouraging. But as we work with both those public agencies and also with the sports groups, the users of these fields as we do the assessment, we'll also be coming back to the park board and letting you know how this work is starting to take shape. And as Jen said, we're trying to capture the big picture of how are our current fields working and not working? What need do we anticipate? And as we start to make site-specific recommendations at places like Tibbetts Valley Park or some of our other master planning sites, we're informed by sort of this bigger sense of how we're going to address athletic fields here in Issaquah now and into the future. Starting with existing properties, and I think I heard your question here, this work is not necessarily going to try and identify potential land to purchase, but if this work informs us that, boy, into the future, as we try and tap the capacity of our existing fields, both school district, state park, city facilities, if there's a need for additional acquisition, this assessment's not gonna necessarily try and identify which site, but I'm hoping that this work would be a sort of taking the long view for the city, for the community, and if that's something this community needs to consider, hopefully this assessment helps us identify that.
Yeah, and then the last thing, I know I said the last one was the last thing, but that maybe this one will be. We received an email from Connie about wetlands and, critical areas. And I do hope that that is, part of this evaluation, because like sometimes it feels like, sometimes we're looking at, pieces of property just like on a map and like it's easy. It looks a lot different when you're actually like, feet on the ground and like the reality of like the muck and the wetness of some of our land. So hopefully, Jen, you're nodding. So is that part of the process?
Correct.
We will be looking at existing field conditions, but to go out and do a wetland study or critical areas study for each of these sites would be cost prohibitive. So right now we're just looking at high level. Obviously we're coming into the wet season. It's a really good time for us to do this work so we can see if there's areas of standing water, which could allude to greater problems. We know at Tibbetts Valley Park, we have additional influences that are happening out there. That's going to be part of that master planning work. As we start going into each of these areas, if we know there's another park or another programmed space that is having some of those capacity or wet issues, we'll definitely be paying attention to those, but we're not going to be able to fund critical area studies for each of these at this stage of the game. It's just cost prohibitive.
So Jen, along those lines and along what Connie had mentioned, can that at least be done at Tibbetts and Veterans, since that's the next two master plans that we would be working on?
We are.
That work is being done in that master planning work. So Tibbetts, for example, as we've been going through the pandemic, some of the work that we've been doing with the consultant team is looking at some of those conditions, looking at the water flow at Tibbetts Valley Park, understanding where water is and where water is going. And so some of that really, really important work, and I would agree with Connie, that's a really important baseline work that is happening through the site-specific work. Just to say what Jen is saying, this high-level citywide assessment is not necessarily the scope that we're going to try and do deep critical area analysis on every one of those the sites, but that is a really, really important step as we start to get site-specific.
Chris, I think I saw your hand.
The recommendations, will they include I want to confirm. So you might look at like a middle school field that's not lighted, but if it were lighted, you could get so many more hours of use per day and per year. And so we'll include options like that, even if that's something the district may have previously not been in favor of.
Yes,
Because
there will be
adding field
recommendations.
lights, yeah,
Yeah.
adding field lights to a single field is maybe single digit or very low percentage of the cost of a whole new field just to get lights.
Right, right.
No,
So
I think-
we will be making recommendations for those areas, but of course, achieving them will take partnership and a lot of efforts to make happen. But yes, we are taking a look at those, and the district is appreciating us having that perspective.
Are both those entities, the state park and the district, receptive to these ideas, or are they? What's your perception of that?
Yeah, again, State Park being there in a master planning effort, they're very in tune to wanting to. They've done some work already as part of their EIS statement. We're working with the information they're providing us, but also we're not wanting to get too ahead of where they're at, knowing they're going to have some information about their fields coming out here in the near future for the public. So we're working really closely with them as far as timing on some of that. And then also the school district, they're very much leaning in from our conversation on the 16th. They look forward to what recommendations and how we can better serve residents and the public.
Yeah, the meeting on the 16th, Chris, as I said, I appreciated that the representation from both state parks and the district was very strong. They seem very supportive in this. I think your example is spot on, right? How can we look at big and relatively small investments to increase capacity within athletic fields? To Danielle's point, right? The fields at Central Park, the 2 baseball fields that are quite small, quite frankly, and very limiting. Are there opportunities to look at making those incrementally a little bit bigger so they can handle more baseball, softball capacity? So these recommendations can take a myriad of forms, but really a chance for us to look at all of these publicly owned fields and see how we can maybe squeeze out some additional capacity, get a good return on an investment.
Marlene?
Yeah, a quick question for you. Just, I am involved a little bit with the Issaquah Little League, and I know they are always, interested in fields and all those things. As we are looking at Sammamish, curious if people are open to, combining efforts, or if there has been any conversations about combining efforts with some of the nonprofit sports leagues to look at grants or funding for some of the improvements at this park. I don't know if that's in scope for what we're currently doing, or if this is just really an evaluation. But it seems like there might be an opportunity to combine forces with some of these youth programs as it relates to grants and those types of things.
Yeah, Marlene, that's a great question. That's probably outside the scope of this higher elevation work. I think as state parks and the fact that they're tuned into this work as they're also doing their master plan, I think some of those conversations really fit well within the master plan work that they're doing, and will be sort of coming out in parallel timing wise to this effort. So I think as we're engaging with them on this effort, as they're completing their master plan, I think some of those creative ideas are really important. They currently work with a nonprofit partner in the operation of those fields already, be it the Issaquah Soccer Club. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know they have those 2 baseball fields and I don't know if it was because of drainage issues that they're not usable. I wasn't quite sure. I know it gets swampy back there. But I know we have people driving way out to use baseball fields. So it'd be nice to make use of those fields. And I know that there is interest in getting creative and the league wanting to put in some legwork in partnership with Sammamish. If I don't know, Brad, if you're on that group as well. But if we want to make that connection offline, happy to do that.
I
Yeah,
think
we
that
can pass-
historically that was those fields were a long time ago used by Issaquah Little League and were maintained by them when they were doing that. That was before my kids were in Little League, but there is historical precedence for that.
Yeah, Marlene, we could put you in touch with state parks. It's probably best a direct conversation with state parks and their master planning effort and what they're thinking of doing with that part of the park.
I will say I do know that part of the park. There's a lot of wetland and stream buffer issues in there, which I think is also part of why those fields have been rendered not highly used at this time.
That was one of my first, one of my hunches, but I figured it was worth doing some research to understand.
Yeah, there's a lot of critical areas in there.
Yeah, that's the primary issue, is the wetness of those fields. And from early parts of the plan of what I've seen, they're actually considering other usage beyond ball fields and stuff for that area, where they could actually use portions of that area and not necessarily have to, mitigate quite so much as they would to use those fields more universally.
Sure.
Actually, my only question, Jen, is there a timeline to when this assessment will be completed?
We're hoping to finish this by Q3. So pretty quick timeline on this, just given the depth of information. I know they're going to be going out and doing some site visits here in the next week or two. So hopefully not too long of a timeline. The public engagement piece might push that a little bit, but as we get ready to, or the engagement with the sports teams, as we finalize those efforts, but we're looking at Q3 right now.
So should have that in place before we make any final decisions on master planning of Tibbetts and veterans.
Correct.
Any other questions or comments for Jen on this topic? Not seeing anything. Thank you, Jennifer. Appreciate that.
Jen.
Guess that moves us on to reports. And looks like, Jeff, you don't need any relief here because you didn't have anything in the main part of the discussion here. So you ought to be good to go here, right?
Wow. Yeah, I guess I'm not out of words other than out of time. So a couple of items really quick. Boy, one of the, I think departmentally, one of our big work plan items, operational items this first couple of months has been staffing. So with the 22 budget adoption, a number of staffing positions that we had lost through the pandemic were rebudgeted. We had a couple of key staff that we lost towards the end of the year. So we've been in a pretty heavy recruitment mode these first 8 weeks within our recreation team. We have a number of positions, a senior center supervisor that'll be coming back, a couple of key positions at the community center, a position at the pool, as well as a position at the Pickering Barn and the farmers market, have all been out for recruitment and are in different stages of selection process within park operations. We have a park operations manager, as well as a couple of our park maintenance worker positions that are nearing the end of that recruitment and should have staff on board here in the next month for those positions. So very encouraging there. I think the other encouraging piece of these recruitments is even in, I guess, this time of the pandemic and maybe at some point post-pandemic, recruitment has been quite competitive. But really pleased to announce that all of our candidate pools have been incredibly strong. I think it speaks well to people want to come and work here in this community and work in Issaquah and be part of the culture here in the Parks Department. So I've been very encouraged by that as those new team members come on board. Culture is really important to us as a department, and as we're committed to serving this community, anything we do, whether it's a capital project or delivering a recreation program, it's really key that we do it. We serve people, and with key staff. So those have been high priorities for us in getting those positions filled with the right people. One last item real fast. Last week at the city council meeting on the 22nd of February, council adopted some modifications to our recreation scholarship program. So tip of the cap to you, Park Board. I know we had come to you a couple months ago with some suggestions and how we were looking at modifying that. Your feedback really helped us to shape up those conversations with council. Those modifications, as I said, were adopted last week, and we are now getting those implemented. Hats off, Melissa. Thank you to you and the recreation team, so that those are ready to go here in the next couple of weeks as summer day camp registrations and spring and summer registrations get underway.
Thanks for all that. Is that it, Jeff?
Yep.
I just have a couple real quick things, two of which are state park stuff. Sunset Beach picnic area and the trails plan at the state park are both moving forward with funding in place for at least a portion of it. And the design process is about 70% complete, I think, on Sunset. And so those will be nice improvements at the state park. The FLISP group, Friends group, is actually having a little St. Patrick's Day event for something called the Shamrock Stroll, which is kind of an informative walk through the park and look at some interpretive signage. That starts March 16th and runs through the 28th. And the last thing I have is I hope people that want to continue onto the board where their terms have ended got their applications in, because that was due by 5 o'clock today. And interviews will be conducted in March for those positions that would continue on for any of you that applied that will start in May. We had the 8 positions open, so it's going to be fast and furious here for Jeff to pull all that together, and I guess myself to some extent, but I'm having to apply myself, so I won't be on the interview team. And Jeff, I assume will do some, we can talk further, but some outreach to see if we can pull together an interview team for sometime in March.
Absolutely. Yep.
And that's all I had. And so I guess it's time to shine. I always hate to make Ryan and Sean wait, but at least you get to see all the juicy action that leads up to it. So in any event, Sean and Ryan, what do you have for us for the youth board?
Sean, do you want to take the lead and I'll follow up with filling in the gaps?
Sure. I can intelligently talk about 2 of the specific events that we're doing to engage the community at this time with the youth board. One has already passed. On February 11th, the youth board did a Harry Potter night, engaging the elementary school kids in a in-person event. So whoop whoop, one of the first in-person events for elementary school kids for the city of Issaquah. We had quite a few, I think 48. We had like a full roster of kids come and enjoy a fun night of activities, crafts, a little bit of sporting action. And it was overall a great success. The youth board, we debriefed that event on the 15th in our meeting. And we're excited to perhaps do it again next year. But it was a huge success. And the other event I want to touch on is the one that's coming up in April 23rd. We have an event for specifically high school students, also in person. Hopefully, the pandemic does not exacerbate the situation and cancel this event, but this has been a long time in the coming. We did plan a second annual version of this event after the first one was a huge success, which did not happen due to the pandemic, but now we're doing it for the quote unquote third time. It's the Dodgeball and Donuts event where high school students come in teams of 5 or 6 and it is joined by a law enforcement officer or first responder, off duty, of course, and they're playing a game of double elimination dodgeball, and we'll have donuts for everyone at the end. So those are the 2 events we're planning or have planned and is currently planning. Ryan, why don't you give us the rest?
Yeah. So in terms of some past work, earlier this month, a group of us came together at the community center to make some Valentine's Day cards for the senior center. So that was a really fun event just to get together in person, since the last time we had an in-person meeting was in December, and to collaborate with the senior center on that. It was really fun just to let our creative juices flow for a while. In terms of some other future things, our annual State of Mind conference is happening, I believe, later this month. And so that's a mental behavioral health conference, typically geared towards high schoolers. It's usually held at Gibson Neck High School. So we're hoping to have a lot of interesting speakers for that. And then finally, we are hoping to hold, I want to say, our 5th annual triathlon, Issy Kids Triathlon, in June. And so that's a really exciting opportunity to be able to hold that for the first time in a couple years, and have kids swimming at Julius Bone Pool, running around the community center and biking alongside the community center on that trail over there. Ruben, I have those key clubs in mind. They will be the first people I will reach out to for volunteers. So yeah, that is what we have in the works for now.
Thank you for all that, Ryan and Sean, especially for all the stuff that you do for our youth and sharing that with us. And I hope you get to share a few of what we do with them as well. So anybody have any questions or comments for either Sean or Ryan? If not, okay, appreciate that. And we're off to the tail end here. Other business or announcements? Anybody have anything? Not seeing anything. So I guess that means we've wrapped it up. Somehow we squeezed it in. Thanks for all your input here tonight. And we'll try and make the best of it here moving forward. So with that, have a good evening. Try and stay dry. Meeting is adjourned.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Discussion.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Good night.